Alrighty, looks like that last video was just a little bit controversial. So let me start this one by saying something we can all agree with. The syringe guns suck. Okay, I know there are a few die-hard Overdose fans out there, but come on guys, even you have to admit that I'm not exactly treading new ground when I say that the syringe guns are objectively bad weapons. Of course, their lack of combat acumen is intentional. They actually have slightly better overall DPS than the SMG if you can believe it, but of course this is counteracted by syringes being among the slowest projectiles in the entire game, and the fact that they come out in an unforgiving arc. Of course, we don't want the syringe guns to be good combat weapons because we don't want to incentivize medic players to drop the medigun and go off blasting enemies. But the syringe guns aren't just bad for combat, they're also very lacking in utility, especially compared to the only medic primary that actually matters, the Crusader's crossbow. Yeah, you can't really make a video on medic primaries without talking about this thing. It is ubiquitous. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It does everything a medic could want. It heals from any range, it allows for higher burst healing than just using the medigun, it reloads passively, it builds uber, and it's undeniably Medic's best ranged combat tool, maybe even his best combat option, period. The only thing it doesn't do is give you teammates that are actually worth healing. But here's the thing, no one really wants to nerf the crossbow. Why? Because it's fun, skill-based, and adds another dimension to Medic's rather linear gameplay. But just because we all like the crossbow, doesn't mean that the syringe guns should be left to rot. Of course, we can't buff them by making their combat better, so how do we buff them? That's what I'd like to discuss in this video. I've come up with 3 concepts for overhauls to each syringe gun that I think gives each one a unique identity, purpose, and most importantly, might make people actually think about which primary to equip. These are the Syringe Gun Solutions. So off the bat, there is one universal change I'd make to all 3 weapons, and that is passive reload. After using them myself to get footage for this video, the constant need to reload after use was one of the most annoying aspects. Every second that you spend reloading is a second where you aren't healing, and more importantly, aren't building uber. Also, the crossbow already has this feature, so there's really no reason not to even the playing field. Alright, now we can dive into each weapon individually, starting with the Blutsauger. The Blutsauger is a very simple weapon concept. Gain 3 HP per needle you hit, and lose 2 HP from your maximum self-healing. For those who don't know, the medic heals himself every second for a minimum of 2 HP and a max of 6, which the Blutsauger cuts down to 4. The identity of this weapon is clearly in benefiting from hitting the enemy, which you might gather from a name like the Bloodsucker. With this in mind, these are the changes I came up with. Firstly, I kept the 3 HP per syringe the same, but I added that you also get 3% uber charge per needle as well. As an additional upside, I also increased the firing speed by 10%. I chose to keep the original downside whilst adding a 25% clip size penalty, bringing each clip down from 40 needles to 30. So why these changes? In keeping with the Bloodsucker theme, this syringe gun is designed to be the most offensively focused. You're supposed to feed off your enemies, and this gun now does exactly that. It's kind of like a primary version of the Ubersaw, obviously trading burst damage and reliability for range. But if your initial thoughts are that this might be too strong, consider this first. The most common classes that you'll engage as medic are probably scouts and spies. Basically light classes in general. From medium range, if the target is at full health, it would take 13 needles to kill, which would get you 39% uber. Doing the same with the Ubersaw would require only 2 swings, which is arguably easier than landing all those needles, and would net you 50% uber. So it's not as busted as you might initially think. The purpose of the clip size reduction is also to prevent you from being able to get full uber from one volley. At max, if you found a heavy that's standing still and letting you shoot him, you can get 90% Uber from a full clip. At that point, you may as well taunt kill with the Uber Saw and get a full 100. No, but seriously, this self-defense situation isn't even where I see this weapon being the most useful. The reason why I gave it a 10% firing speed increase is so that you can quickly swap to it in the middle of a firefight, gain a bit of Uber, and then switch back to healing as quickly as possible. Even landing 3 to 4 quick needles can jump you up around 10% Uber, which might be exactly what you need to make a push. I imagine that with somewhat liberal usage, this could be the quickest way to build Uber. It's kind of got the inverse gameplay loop of the crossbow. Instead of burst healing your teammates and getting a small bit of Uber before switching back to the medigun, you deal a small burst of damage to the enemy. I really had to think about whether or not to give the weapon any increase to its DPS, but I think 10% is enough to make a noticeable difference in its optimal use case, while being small enough to not convince people to run it full time. With these changes, the weapon retains its identity and gains an extremely useful, potentially game-winning upside in return for worse performance in sustained firefights and worse self-healing. Moving on now to the Overdose, which is already the best of the 3 syringe guns, though that's not saying much. It currently sports a mobility mechanic based on Ubercharge percent. 2% extra movement speed per 10% charge, reaching a max of 128% speed at full Uber. Those percentages probably mean nothing to you, so for comparison, the Scout moves at 133% speed and the Medic's default speed is 107%. As a downside, this movement buff is only active while you're holding the Overdose out, and the weapon itself has a 15% damage penalty. Which is actually almost nothing. It translates to about 1 damage loss per needle at mid to long range and 2 at max ramp up. So how would I improve this? To start, I'm keeping the movement mechanic exactly as is. I've seen plenty of people suggest that the speed boost should be passive and not restricted to when you've got the Overdose out, but I really don't think that the weapon needs this buff, and I also don't think that Spy's life should get any harder than it already is. Can you imagine trying to catch up to a medic running this thing and failing even when he hasn't noticed you? No thanks. Nah, instead I opted for this. A 50% increase in Ubercharge duration. This brings the stock, Kritzkrieg and Quick Fix Ubers up to 12 seconds from 8, and brings each Vaccinator bubble up to 3.75 seconds from 2.5. Not only is this a thematic change, kind of like you're overdosing on Uber, but it also synergizes with the other upside. You use the extra speed to make smart decisions and stay alive, and in return, you are rewarded for staying alive with a longer Uber. I can see this being really useful in situations where the enemy team has a massive defensive hold with multiple sentries. It can be really hard to deal with even a single wrangled sentry, let alone 2 or 3. With this, you now have effectively 1.5 Ubers to work with and try to take them down. It could also make flashing Uber to your teammates more viable, although I think that flashing is currently percentage based and drops Uber by 12.5% per teammate flashed, which is equivalent to 1 second of Uber charge. But since they'd have to play around with the values to extend the Uber duration in the first place, I can totally see it being possible to flash teammates more frequently with this change. And obviously, every other minigun also benefits from the increased Uber uptime. More time to do damage with crits, more healing done with the quick fix, and more effective bubbles with the Vaccinator. To balance this out, I've changed the damage penalty from -15% to -90%. I want this thing doing 1 damage per needle, maybe 2 at point blank. It's going to be very obvious that this is not a combat weapon, it is utility only. Use your extra movement speed to avoid danger, not your combat abilities. I have a sneaking suspicion that these changes would make the Overdose a little too strong, so if that ends up being the case, I would suggest adding something like a -10 to -15% Ubercharge build rate penalty. But at the moment, I'm comfortable with not incorporating that change unless it's truly necessary. Finally, the stock syringe gun. This one was the hardest to come up with buffs for because it's a stock weapon. It doesn't really have stats to play around with or to build off of. But I thought about it for quite some time, and I eventually came up with something. You know how back in the Blutsauger section I talked about how the medic will naturally heal himself for a minimum of 2 HP and a maximum of 6 HP per second? Well, I'm going to change that. The medic now heals himself for a minimum of 5 HP and a max of 10. In addition, the Overdose and Crusader's Crossbow both receive a new downside, lowering their minimum healing to 2 and maximum healing to 6, with the Blutsauger maintaining a minimum of 2 and a max of 4. So effectively, none of those 3 weapons would be any different from how they are right now, with only the Syringe Gun benefiting from this change. But why this change? The thing is, being a stock weapon in a weapon type that is designed to be bad, there is no way that the Syringe Gun can ever truly compete with the alternative options. Obviously we're not buffing its damage capabilities, and there's no utility stats that we can give it without taking away its identity as a stock weapon. So who exactly is the audience for stock? Who exactly is going to have this weapon equipped? That's right, new players. This version of the Syringe Gun is specifically designed to function as training wheels for new medics whose game sense and positioning skills still need development, and who also don't have any other options anyway. Hopefully this change can keep these new and budding medic players alive long enough for them to start to learn the class properly, and then once they finally become comfortable and understand the medic's role, they can switch off the Syringe Gun to a weapon that better suits their playstyle or the team's current needs. So those are my ideas for overhauling the Syringe Guns. I'm really quite happy with what I've come up with. Not only does each option retain their identities, but each one fills an entirely different niche. The Blutsauger is the best offensive Syringe Gun and has a strong focus on building Uber the quickest. The Overdose is all about surviving and using Ubercharge. The Crossbow is still the best for healing teammates and for ranged combat. And the Syringe Gun functions as the perfect set of training wheels for new players and people who are still getting used to the class. Importantly, I think there are actual reasons for using each option, and scenarios where switching between them is the optimal play. I really wanted these changes to make medic players think about which primary to go with, and I reckon I've done a pretty good job at that. But what do you think? Would any of these changes make you put away your professional killstreak festive Crusader's Crossbow? Are any of the changes going overboard in your opinion, or would you opt for something else entirely? I'd love to hear your thoughts, though hopefully you don't tear me to pieces in the comment section this time. With that said, if you made it this far, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, and until next time, have a good one.